Welcome. This is kind of an introductory session about a new resource that we have produced as part of the GLAM-E lab, which of course stands for Galleries, Libraries, Archives, and Museums. We're based at the University of Exeter and also the Engelberg Center on Innovation Law and Policy at NYU Law School in the US. And our remit, and especially for the past 4 or more years since we've been funded in doing this work, is to provide resources and guidance and collaborate with smaller and medium-sized cultural institutions and community organizations, thinking about like what does it mean to do open access in a way that is achievable, that is, compartmentalized, that can be broken up into different phases and stages so that we're kind of creating the building blocks for a larger program of work that can cost as little or as much as an organization has available to them. And we even mean that in terms of labor. Okay. If all you have is labor, how do we start with the resources that we already have and roll out an open access program from there? So I'm Andrea Wallace. Francesca Farmer is also here today to help me present on the work that we've been doing. And so I just told you a little bit about us. But who we are is also very much embedded in the structure and in the way that the toolkit was developed. So I mentioned that, we're a kind of cross-border collaboration looking at cross-border issues around copyright. But we've also been working in very close partnership with Francesca, who is based at the Royal Albert Memorial Museum and Art Gallery here in Exeter, to test a lot of these tools and guidance things, hand in hand with an institution who's implementing an open access policy and thinking about what it means to work towards a broader open access strategy across the institution. But also with Wikimedia UK. So some of the work that we're going to be presenting was also developed with Lucy Henney, who was our Wikipedian in residence at the Royal Albert Memorial Museum and Art Gallery, and with the GLAM-E lab over the past year. So Open Glam Toolkit. Okay, what is it? So you're gonna see a lot of different guides, a lot of different tools. I think this existential question of like, what even is a toolkit, right, anymore, is a very good one for us to be asking because we try to develop different types of what we'll call very broadly tools, depending on how comprehensive or even how minimal a different stage of this process may be. So in some cases, we'll be talking about handbooks. In some cases, we'll be talking about just kind of superficial guidance or templates or sandbox tools, but we'll highlight how each of these kind of come into play as we're thinking about what it looks like to go along that strategy. But the way that we set the toolkit up itself is that people can insert themselves and kind of activate different steps depending on where they are in their open access journey. So all of these things we're going to walk through with you today, and we're going to do it in the order that you would approach it if you were starting at the very, very first stage. But if you're a bit further along within your institution and maybe leadership is already on board and you're starting to think about like what practically it means to start using open licenses and public domain tools, you'll see where you should insert yourself into the structure of the toolkit when we come to that specific tool. So, Francesca.
So we identified 4 key steps in the development of the toolkit. The first being preparing for open access. So deciding within your organization how you want to undertake your open access journey. We identified internal and external research to be key parts of this. So look at what other open access organizations are doing, see if there's stuff that you can replicate, but also check within your organization itself and make sure that you have the tools and the staff that you need to be able to do that. You should also decide where you'll publish your open access work. So at RAM, we chose Wikimedia Commons. And also it helps if you have a group of core staff to do some of this work so that you can assign the roles. The next step is then clearing copyright. So identifying the copyright status of works within your collection and those that you can release open access. You can do this either in bulk or by item. And then we moved on to publishing collections, so making sure that you have everything you need to be able to publish the works online. Make sure that your metadata is all organized and your images are all sorted and sized properly and contain the right information, and make sure that you apply CC0 where possible. And then finally is updating your policies. So auditing your existing website and your policies and updating them to make sure that you include your open access work and make sure that they all work together. Next slide, please. So we wanted to make sure that the toolkit was as accessible as possible. So we have both a web-based version and a downloadable version, which is available as a PDF. The images all have alt text in them as well. So it just makes sure that anyone can access them, really.
Great. So now we're going to walk you through what each of these documents is and what they do. So when you go to the website, you'll be directed to our tools page, and you'll see kind of in chronological order where to start. The first document is Go Open with GLAM-E. We refer to this as our onboarding document, and it's going to introduce you to what we call the GLAM-E lab method of building an open access program. So it walks you through some of the philosophical questions that you should be asking about your organization and what your goals are for adopting open access. But we also recommend the most sustainable approach to an open access policy, which is orienting it around the legal premise that no new copyright arises in a faithful reproduction of a public domain work, and that CC0 is the most reliable and accessible open public domain tool for you to apply to those materials. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to the copyright clearance document. But really what that does is it takes you from a position of how do I apply open to everything in my collection to how do I identify a specific set of collections that are legally and ethically appropriate for a CC0 statement, and how do I design all of the workflows and new processes that I need to do around that small set of collections. Okay. This is the way of, again, starting to ask questions about who needs to be included in that discussion. What are there other factors to be aware of when we start to talk about copyright and clearing rights within them? So, copyright is not the only thing that you should be thinking about as you identify a collection that does enable you to do that. We have traditional knowledge and cultural expressions, of course, database rights, privacy and data protection, and a little bit of some service information about how to mitigate risk or manage unknowns. And for the most part, a lot of what we do is recommend that you set some of those more risk perceiving things aside and choose a collection that doesn't raise any of those concerns for you. Because as you start to build up your skills, you'll also expand your knowledge around how to go about approaching those questions as and when you encounter them again. So some of the things that we also recommend is having conversations early on about the quality of images and metadata that you want to publish, where you should be publishing them, as Francesca mentioned, and really having this be kind of your draft approach to how you would then want to test what those decisions are as you proceed along. The next stage in that process is developing an internal open access policy. And think of this as a workflow and kind of grounding document for your organization. It's going to help you identify those works that you do decide to proceed to go along with. And then it will help you kind of think about what it means to set up a clearance process where you and all of the people who need to be involved in that clearance process are able to evaluate the suitability of the works or a group of works that you're going to include in your open access program. So we talk about how to kind of structure it, to get people on board, to think about the very specific questions that you should be asking about what copyright law protects so that you can spot it when it arises in an asset, but also thinking beyond the object and drawing out very specific topics that also might appear in images, like photographs of architectural works, things that are in public spaces, where we start to think about questions like the freedom of panorama, the country of publication, and even employment questions that might arise that some people might think are constricting, but they can also be liberating, right? Because you can think about the ways that employment or having staff within your organization do some of the work actually enables you to apply a CC0 where you may not have thought about it in that way in the past, even if copyright does arise. The thing that you should keep in mind here is when we're asking a question about open access, there are ways that the CC0 tool can also enable you to publish something that you previously thought, because the organization has rights in it, may not have been publishable. Of course, there may be contractual restrictions, privacy, or other sorts of things that we want to consider, but it's not as complicated as all of this. This is more of an issue spotting tool so that you can start to organize what your internal open access policy looks like. We then ask you to assess and mitigate risk. And these first three documents are anywhere between like 10 and maybe 4 pages. They're all accompanied by additional resources and things. So once again, they're meant to be divided up into different components, and also not be too overwhelming. But if in going through your kind of internal open access policy process, you decide that you need a more comprehensive assessing and mitigating risk approach, then we have a document for that. So this guide helps you think about what that framework is going to look like. What do you need to be doing, and how do you set up a structure to really think about, is there risk that arises, and then actually measuring the capacity for that risk, or any sorts of takedown policies or things that you can put in place to mitigate that risk. Because as cultural institutions, we always want to be doing the most ethical thing possible, but risk and copyright isn't necessarily something that prevents us from doing something that we want to do in terms of ethics, right? And it actually could be ethical to decide, you know what, we may not know comprehensively, but we feel very certain about this. And we're going to put a robust takedown policy in place, because otherwise people will not have access to these very important materials, right? So we give you a little bit to kind of weigh for and against the decisions that you might want to be taking. And you'll also start to see that we actually start to group resources, because the toolkit itself is currently designed for UK, US, and EU organizations. One of the reasons for that is we originally were doing US and UK, but then UK law very conveniently aligned itself with the originality principle officially, right, in the EU, in a way that allowed us to bring the EU into this as we were developing it as well. So that was fabulous. But we do kind of break things apart depending on where certain institutions may be located geographically and what additional concerns they might have. This is where you'll start to see a more comprehensive handbook emerge. Okay, so, and necessarily so, because the Copyright Clearance Handbook is designed for UK and EU institutions, as well as US institutions, to be able to walk through and do a step-by-step guide for clearing copyright in the works. So again, at the very beginning of this, we actually talk about why we recommend CC0, and I'll give you a little highlight of that. There's technically 3 different tools that you could use for if you want to release public domain materials. And CC0 is the one that is it's the Creative Commons Universal Public Domain dedication. Now, Creative Commons also has a public domain mark, which is intended to be applied to works that are in the public domain worldwide, okay? And then there's also a rights statement that is specific to US institutions for out of copyright in the US, and that's because US copyright law is a mess, says the US trained lawyer, in terms of what the term of copyright is. And so when we come, kind of to this section, if you're able to apply a public domain statement, we actually recommend applying CC0, because it tells everyone, first and foremost, whoever has released this had the authority to put CC0 on there. But also, it's a better user-centered tool for when users encounter works in the wild, whether they're on your website, on Wikimedia Commons, or somewhere else. They see that CC0 and they can trust it, because the actual legal code in CC0 has what's called a fallback license in it that tells users, even if you're in a place in the world where rights do arise in these materials, we will never enforce them. So it makes it makes the user's encounter and use of the materials risk-free. And it's something that we're even seeing data aggregators and other people or who are commercial organizations, all of these things that are using institutional data and collections are starting to filter by CC0 and CC BY because it is a reliable statement rather than the public domain mark or some other sort of generic statement. So the way that we set this up is we ask you to look at the underlying work of art in your image, the digitization of that work of art, and then also the metadata that's attached to it. And we have a step-by-step process across 3 different checklists that help you identify what the specific material is, who created it, and so on. Then whether digitization of that asset actually receives its own new copyright or not, and even if it does, and the person who has created that asset works for your organization, you can still mark it CC0. And then the last is just to think about the metadata that you have, whether you want to include more metadata than basic tombstone data and kind of description about the asset. And if so, and you mark that CC0, it tells someone not just the image and the underlying work, but also the metadata embedded in it is all copyright free and can be used for any purpose. You'll also see that we have been thinking about the challenges that people often have when they're trying to do a copyright clearance process, partly because Francesca and I have encountered a lot of these challenges ourselves when working with collections that multiple people have in the collections management database inserted different information into, or even used different naming conventions for how an artist is named, and these sorts of things. So what we've done is we created a copyright clearance log that clears copyright based on the creator in a way that it tracks the information about the work, the full name of the creator, the death year, the expiration of the copyright year. We have some other information in here like gender and nationality that can also be useful for when you're thinking about designing your open access program and you may want to do promotions around International Women's Day or trans awareness and these sorts of things. As well as nationality, if there's any certain appreciation days or things like Cinco de Mayo coming up, where that you have an artist who potentially is Mexican and has done some liberation work around that. So this can help you start to kind of structure that information in a way where you can more easily find it and use it for your open access program. But it also includes a space to document the reasoning behind why you've decided that there's no copyright in all of the works by this creator, as well as who made that conclusion. And sometimes it's just very, very easy. Like none of Da Vinci's works were ever in copyright, right? Because more than 500 years ago, copyright did not exist in the form that it does now. So there could be very easy ways for you to document in this instance, it's a Google Doc, what those decision-making processes are so that you continue to build confidence across the organization, but also in a way that, may be difficult depending on your existing software and documentation systems. And you'll see that there's 2 tabs to this spreadsheet. So we have one that's the spreadsheet key. The other is where you actually record the information. But at the very end of our copyright clearance handbook, you'll see a more detailed and accessible appendix that has all of these descriptions in there and color coded in a way that when you see the colors at the top, you'll see that they match where you're supposed to be kind of inserting that information.
So the next tool is the Image and Metadata Handbook for Wikimedia Commons. First off, why did we choose Wikimedia Commons? Mostly because it's free. Also, it has a very low barrier to entry, so it's quite easy for anyone to upload works onto Wikimedia Commons. And lastly, it gets lots of eyeballs, so it gives you tools to track how many views your images are getting, and you can then use that data to justify further open access work or to release reports on your open access work. Um, so this guide is a step-by-step guide that basically teaches you how to upload works onto Wikimedia Commons. It has a number of different checklists. So the first is all around creating a Wikipedia account and downloading the specific software packages you need. The second provides guidance on organizing your images and using additional software to embed image metadata into your works. Um, the third provides guidance on verifying whether your organization has a Wikidata entry and a category page, which would allow you to group all your images together. Um, and the fourth provides guidance on generating the specific spreadsheet that the software provides. So we recommended PattyPan because a low barrier to entry. I know that you can use OpenRefine, but we aimed the toolkit at small organizations that might not have the capacity to learn a new coding language. And finally, the last checklist provides guidance on how to actually bulk upload the works onto Wikimedia Commons. Um, Similarly to the copyright clearance document, if you could go to the next slide. We also have created a spreadsheet which we've called the Sandbox template for Wikimedia Commons metadata management, which is a very catchy title. Um, and this highlights all the key columns that you will need when uploading things using the Wikimedia Commons artwork template. So that's the one that was created for GLAMs by Wikimedia Commons volunteers to make sure that the appropriate information is included when you upload your artworks. Again, this is a Google Sheet, so anyone can access it. And it just means that you are able to kind of have all that key information in one place.
Now, one thing that you might also be wondering is, well, I am a participant of Europeana. How do I make this toolkit work for me as opposed to Wikimedia Commons? The Wikimedia Commons handbook is something that has some useful information in there for embedding stuff into your actual image assets. We also recommend downloading Adobe Bridge and thinking about the ways that you can use metadata templates to insert that information in bulk as well. But anything that you would be doing or thinking about, regardless of where you publish for the rest of the toolkit, is going to be relevant for how you provide your data and structure your data so that it can be ingested into Europeana. And so this is where some of the other questions may kick in. So if you've decided, great, we are going to do the CC0, but we have a lot of other works for which we cannot apply CC0, and we want those works to also be ingested into Europeana, this is a wonderful little guide for you to be thinking about the alternative licenses and labels that are available for your collections. In addition to walking you through the rights statements labels and when and how to use those, we also raise the local context notices and labels that are available to be applied in partnership with the relevant community who holds rights in those materials, as well as when you might decide to actually apply, or perhaps a rights holder that is not you decides to apply one of the more restrictive Creative Commons licenses. So these are kind of examples of a couple of the flowcharts that we have in there. The very top one, helping you understand where Creative Commons licenses compare to the rights statements labels, when they can be used, and where they fall along that kind of copyright spectrum in terms of, okay, we've got full copyright, all rights reserved. What are the sorts of labels that we should be applying in this instance? All the way kind of over to the right, where maybe we know that there are no restrictions, and if we can't apply one of the Creative Commons public domain tools, what are some of the other labels that are available to us to communicate why? And maybe it's because there's contractual restrictions that you have signed with a third party around how those things can be digitized or made available. We also highlight what the terms are that are expected when you use the license, which is actually saying what those contractual restrictions are and how they apply to you, so that there's a little bit more clarity around whether a CC license is appropriate or whether a rights statements label is better to be used. Then we also have a handy little flowchart that walks you through what to do if the work is protected by copyright. So let's say you just can't apply one of those public domain tools, but you're not really sure which one you should be applying instead. You can use this flowchart to ask certain questions that then will help you identify the right label to apply. And these are at the very end of the document. So the idea is that, you've kind of walked through and refreshed your memory about kind of the way that these things are set up and meant to actually help your organization. And then when you get to the end, you'll know what all of these labels and everything mean, or you'll at least know where to go in the guidance document to find out about them. Lastly, once you've started to publish all of these materials online, you'll want to make sure that you go through your website or any areas where you do have information about your copyright policy or now your new open access policy and communicate to the public where and how they can find public domain and openly licensed materials. So we have written a more comprehensive policy that can be copied and pasted, and we've signaled where certain placeholders exist, for you to fill in your own information. You can edit this to your heart's content. It is CC0. You may decide out of the 3 pages that are in there, you only want to use in total a page and a half. Feel free. You don't even need to cite us. We have just put all of this in there so that you feel less overwhelmed by that final step. And there's helpful reminders, even to include links directly to, for example, your Wikimedia Commons page or to your contributor page on Europeana so that people can see in a more maybe presentable interface where all of your assets are and how they can use them. Last but not least, we have a working glossary. So you're probably going to come across a lot of words throughout any of these handbooks, or even just in general when we're talking about Open GLAM, for which you're thinking, that doesn't make sense, or what is this, or I don't quite get that. These are meant to be enabling rather than disabling. They are not exhaustive. They are our definitions in terms of how we are using them. But we also find that they can be very helpful for helping people who are moving into this space kind of grasp, for example, what is meant between an open license that aligns with open access standards on commercial use and modification and allowing that versus a closed license, which prohibits commercial use and modification, but still waives some of the rights in the bundle within the copyright framework. So please, by all means, if you look through here and you see that there is a word missing, reach out to us. We'll have a think and we'll make sure to insert it in there. It's also now been translated into Spanish, so we're very excited about that too. But that's also one of the reasons why everything on our website is either CC0 or CC BY, because we want people to be able to translate these into languages for which it would be useful for them to make their own resources and adapt them to their institution's needs.
So we also thought it would be useful to highlight how the toolkit can be used. In summer last year, we published the Making the Business Case for Open Access white paper, which details all of the work that we've done at the Royal Albert Memorial Museum. It highlights the specific work that we've done, so the internal research, external research, the pilot that we'd done, how we were able to seek permission from Exeter City Council, who are the leaders of the museum. But it also highlights specific findings, so how many views our images got, whether or not we were able to redirect investment from image licensing into open access, how it delivered on our policy for diversity, equality, and inclusion, and also how organizations can continue to generate. It also then has recommendations on how the work can be replicated. So essentially, kind of the toolkit, but broken down for a specific organization. And then we also thought it'd be useful just to kind of highlight what we've done. The main thing that we found was that organizations can start small and pilot the work. So at RAM, we uploaded 63 images onto Wikimedia Commons. These were predominantly watercolors of buildings in and around the Exeter area that no longer exist. Either they were demolished due to the Blitz or because they were no longer sanitary. And so we uploaded those images just to see what would happen with them. And over the space of a year, the images got 4.7 million image views on Wikimedia platforms, and they were used in 7 different language Wikipedias. They've been included on Wikidata as well as Wiktionary. And we basically found that you can make a significant impact from a really small set of images that might not be of interest to that many people. But once you put them online, you don't know who will decide that actually they are worth seeing and whether or not to include them on Wikipedia pages, but also to include them on other websites. We also had tour guides from Exeter thanking us for uploading the artworks because they could then use them on their tours. Um, we also found that redirecting the investment in image licensing can bring significant net gains, um, and that organizations can continue to generate income. At RAM, we release medium resolution images, so 300 dpi at A5, which we believe to be quite a generous medium, but we also retain high quality images for image licensing to make sure that we're not missing out completely on any income that we might generate. But we also found that open access can simplify rights management processes. Staff are freed up to do other work, more mission critical work, rather than constantly replying to requests to use their images. Um, and also, we found that open access can cost as much or as little as you can afford. So at RAM, we're not a very large museum. We used free tools to make sure that we would not end up spending lots of money on this. And we found that using free tools still means that you get a lot of people accessing your works. And finally, that open access is best when everyone feels involved. So we kind of make sure at the museum that all members of staff know what's happening. I send out kind of quarterly data emails to everyone just so they know what's happening. And we are also including that in our yearly report for stakeholders as well.
So if you decide to do this, and or you do, just one of the other things we want to do is advertise and also include you in a list of institutions around the world that have taken the same decision. So one of the other things that we've been working on as part of the GLAM-E lab is taking a survey, and we mean this in terms of like a land management survey where we're surveying the landscape and what's happening around open access rather than a survey where we're sending out questions and asking people to send us back data. Because Douglas McCarthy and I have been managing previously in a Google Sheet, now in this beautiful interactive platform, a list of cultural institutions that do make anywhere from 1 to millions of assets available for any reuse purpose. And so if your institution takes this step, we will include you to update so that when people go and they look for institutions either in their country or a specific type, they can sort, they can find your information. And then we create an institution profile page as well that shows what platforms you've published your assets, under what licenses, and even links to your open access policy. And eventually we'll pull the leads in from Wikimedia or from Wikipedia about each institution so that people learn a little bit more about the institution as they're looking through the assets that they've made available. So with that, thank you so much. We're super excited to now be rolling out the toolkit and hopefully get some feedback on it. We can start with any questions that you all might have, or we could have an open conversation about maybe what your organization's biggest challenge to open is and what you're currently facing at the moment.